life's a long story, how about yours? My life's a long story, how about yours? When I was a kid, growing up in the hills of West Virginia, I experienced a Thanksgiving that I will never forget. Now, usually on Thanksgiving, my mother would set a fabulous table. She would have an ironed linen tablecloth, and there would be a beautiful bouquet of flowers on the table. She'd have her finest china and crystals set out. But not this year. Not the year I want to tell you about. No, this year, we went to the amazing Zicafoose Sisters' house for Thanksgiving. Now, the Zicafoose Sisters were legendary, combat-hardened missionaries who had lived and worked in the Congo. They were college friends of my parents. And I found out just a few years ago that the Zicafoose Sisters were not actually sisters. They were lesbians in a time when it was illegal to be gay, especially in the church. Now, Elizabeth, she was round and soft, with flushed pink cheeks and pale blue eyes, and she wore her graying blonde hair in braids wrapped on top of her head. Margaret wore her hair like a Marine, and she was a nurse midwife who had delivered hundreds of babies in the African bush. And when they retired, they bought this little piece of land way in the bowels of West Virginia. And they built a strange little cabin with the help of some neighbors who were moonshiners. It was West Virginia. Now, their cabin was so far out in the middle of nowhere that they had to come and get you. That's how far out in the middle of nowhere their cabin was. Margaret, she would come and pick you up in her pale green Army surplus Jeep that had a windshield but no roof, windows, or doors. And she drove us the last 3 miles to that cabin over roots and rocks, straight through a cow pasture. And every time she'd hit a fresh cow patty, it would explode all over the Jeep, and she would cuss like a sailor, which was all very exotic, because I had never heard curse words strung into a sentence before. Now, when we got to the cabin, Margaret parked the Jeep on this enormous rock ledge that hung out over a racing river that came down the mountainside, cascading over boulders and rocks and fallen trees. And from the very first minute I laid eyes on that cabin, I knew that it had been made by people who had been drinking. For one thing, the cabin was built in the middle of the river, not next to it. And to get from the rock ledge over to the cabin, you had to cross this swinging bridge that was made out of skinned maple saplings. And my teetotaling mother always said that crossing that swinging bridge was the closest she ever got to drinking. Now, on the outside, the Zicafoose Sisters' cabin looked like a moonshiner's shack. But when you opened the door, you were in Africa. The living room rug was a zebra hide, and witch doctor masks glared down at you from the stacked stone fireplace. You could hear the river running under the rough-hewn floor. And because the cabin was built on top of the river, you had to cross little bridges to get from one room to the next. You had to cross about a 4.5 bridge to get from the 4.5-foot bridge to get from the living room into the kitchen, and you had to cross about a 6-foot bridge to get from the living room into the bedrooms. And we had just crossed the 4.5-foot bridge from the living room into the kitchen, and were sitting down to a lovely Thanksgiving meal of hot squirrel stew, cornbread fresh from the skillet, and my mother's pumpkin pie, when the trouble started. There came a pounding at the door, and the sound of drunk men's voices outside. Margaret cursed under her breath, and when she opened that door, 3 drunk moonshiners all but fell onto that zebra hide rug. That's how drunk they were. And they were carrying a young teenage girl, about my age, and she was very, very pregnant. Now, it wasn't clear who the baby's daddy was, but it was obvious that the oldest moonshiner was the girl's daddy, because he started blubbering. Margaret, I'd hated to interrupt you on Thanksgiving like this, but she's been crying like this all day, and the baby won't come. I didn't know what else to do, Margaret. Margaret didn't answer him. She just started pulling the quilts off of the couch and laying them on the floor in front of the roaring fire. As soon as Elizabeth saw what Margaret was doing, she went and put the tea kettle on, and then she took a big dishpan and filled it with clean towels. Then she crossed that bridge into the living room, and I followed her because I wanted to know what was going to happen next. Well, Margaret, she had those moonshiners lay the girl down on top of those quilts in front of that roaring fire. And then she had the girl's daddy sit down and cradle her head in his lap. And then Margaret started reading that girl's belly like it was a book. She looked at me and she said, I need you to run over across that bridge and bring me that black bag that's sitting next to the picture of me with the rhinoceros. So I ran across the bridge and I went into the bedroom and I found like a black doctor's bag, and it was sitting right next to the photo of Margaret with a rhino. I got the bag and I ran in and put it down next to Margaret. She flipped the latch open and she took out a stethoscope. And she started listening to that girl's belly. And then she opened that bag all the way up and she took out a tray. It had a clean linen towel on it, a razor-sharp scalpel, a pair of tongs tipped in rubber, a curved needle with a piece of thread already in it, an amber-colored bottle with an eyedropper, and a big wad of cotton. And as she took the eyedropper off that bottle and started putting some of the liquid on the cotton, Margaret talked to the girl. Now, darling, honey, I'm going to have to help you have this baby, honey. I want you to just breathe this and try to relax. And she took that wad of cotton and she pressed that up against that girl's nose. And she fell back into her daddy's lap, fast asleep. And then Margaret, she took that girl's legs and she pushed them up in the air, and then she spread them all the way apart. She took her skirts and she wrapped them up over her belly. Then she picked up that razor-sharp scalpel. She leaned over that girl, and I leaned over to see what she was going to do. And she put that scalpel down into that girl. I passed out. When I came to, there was blood everywhere, and I saw Margaret sewing up that girl with that curved needle. But I heard a baby crying. And I looked over there and I saw Elizabeth was washing this beautiful little baby boy. He had jet black hair. And then she took a baby blanket and she wrapped it really tightly around him and tucked the bottom of it in around his little feet. And then she laid him down in his mother's arms. And the girl was crying. She was screaming again. And so Margaret took more of that liquid and she put it on that cotton and she pressed it up against that girl's nose, and it was good night, nurse. And the old man, he started blubbering again. Margaret, I don't know what she would have done without you, Margaret. I don't know what she would have done. Margaret looked him straight in the eyes. And she said, she would have died, Clinton. That's what she would have done. She would have died. You did the right thing bringing her here. And then Elizabeth, she came up behind the old fellow and she squeezed him on the shoulders and she said, now, Clinton, I don't imagine that Darla had a chance to do any cooking today. So what say you and the boys just stay here and have Thanksgiving supper with us? What do you say? He nodded and he wiped all the tears off his face. And then we all crossed over that 4.5-foot bridge from the living room into the kitchen. And we sat down to a wonderful Thanksgiving dinner of hot squirrel stew, cornbread fresh from the skillet, and my mother's homemade pumpkin pie. And the missionaries and the moonshiners, they started trading stories. It was amazing. All the escapades they had had. All while that young girl and her newborn baby slept there by that roaring fire. Witch doctor masks glaring down at them from the fire to keep them safe. My life's a long story. How about yours? How about yours? Thank you very much.